Chapter 1 On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S. Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards K. Bridge. He had successfully avoided meeting his landlady on the staircase. His garret was under the roof of a high 5-storied house, and was more like a cupboard than a room. The landlady who provided him with garret, dinners, and attendance lived on the floor below, and every time he went out, he was obliged to pass her kitchen, the door of which invariably stood open. And each time he passed, the young man had a sick, frightened feeling which made him scowl and feel ashamed. He was hopelessly in debt to his landlady, and was afraid of meeting her. This was not because he was cowardly and abject, quite the contrary. But for some time past he had been in an overstrained, irritable condition, verging on hypochondria. He had become so completely absorbed in himself and isolated from his fellows that he dreaded meeting not only his landlady, but anyone at all. He was crushed by poverty, but the anxieties of his position had of late ceased to weigh upon him. He had given up attending to matters of practical importance. He had lost all desire to do so. Nothing that any landlady could do had a real terror for him, but to be stopped on the stairs, to be forced to listen to her trivial, irrelevant gossip, pestering demands for payment, threats, and complaints, and to rack his brain for excuses to prevaricate, to lie no rather than that, he would creep down the stairs like a cat, and slip out unseen. This evening, however, on coming out in the street, he became acutely aware of his fear. "I won't attempt to think like that, and am frightened by these trifles," he thought, with an odd smile. Yes, all is in a man's hand, and he lets it all slip from cowardice. That's an axiom. It would be interesting to know what it is men are most afraid of. Taking a new step, uttering a new word, is what they fear most. But I'm talking too much. It's because I chatter that I do nothing, or perhaps it is that I chatter because I do nothing. Have learned to chatter this last month, lying for days together in my den thinking of Jack the Giant Killer. Why am I going there now? Am I capable of that? Is that serious? It is not serious at all. It's simply a fantasy to amuse myself, a plaything. Yes, maybe it's a plaything. The heat in the street was terrible, and the airlessness and the bustle and the plaster, scaffolding, bricks, and dust all about him. And that special Petersburg stand so familiar to all who are unable to get out of town in summer, all worked painfully upon the young man's already overwrought nerves. The insufferable stench from the pot-houses, which are particularly numerous in the part of the town, and the drunken men who came he met continually, although it was a working day, completed the revolting misery of the picture. An expression of the profoundest disgust gleamed for a moment in the young man's refined face. He was, by the way, exceptionally handsome, above the average in height, slim, well-built, with beautiful dark eyes and dark brown hair. Soon he sank into deep thought, or more accurately speaking, into complete blackness of mind. He walked along not observing what was about him, and not caring to observe it. From time to time he would mutter something, from the habit of talking to himself, to which he had just confessed. At these moments he would become conscious that his ideas were sometime in a tangle, and that he was very weak. For 2 days he had scarcely tasted food. He was so badly dressed that even a man accustomed to shabbiness would have been ashamed to be seen in the streets in such rags. In that quarter of town, however, scarcely any shortcoming in dress would have created surprise, owing to the proximity of the Hay Market, the number of the establishments of bad character, the preponderance of the trading and working-class population crowded in these streets and alleys in the heart of Petersburg. Types so various were to be seen in the streets that no figure, however queer, would have caused surprise. But there was such accumulated bitterness and contempt in the young man's heart that in spite of all fastidiousness of youth, he minded his rags least of all in the street. It was a different matter when he met with acquaintances or with former fellow-students, whom indeed he disliked meeting at any time. And yet when a drunken man who, for unknown reason, was being taken somewhere in a huge wagon dragged by a heavy dray horse, suddenly shouted at him as he drove past, "Hey there, German Hatter!" Bawling at the top of his voice and pointing at him, The young man stopped suddenly and clutched tremulously at his hat. It was a tall round hat from Zimmer's but completely worn out, rusty with age, and all torn and bespattered, brimless and bent on one side in a most unseemly fashion. Not shame, however, but quite another feeling akin to terror him. "I knew it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought so. That's the worst of all. Why, a stupid thing like this, the most trivial detail might spoil the plan. Yes, my hat is too noticeable. It looks absurd, and that makes it noticeable. With my rags, I ought to wear a cap and any sort of old pancake, but not this grotesque thing. Nobody wears such a hat. It would be noticeable a mile off. It would be remembered. What matters is that people would remember it, and that would give them a clue. For this business one should be as little conspicuous as possible. Trifles, that what matter? Why, it's just such trifles that always ruin everything." He had not far to go. He knew indeed how many steps it was from the gate of his lodging house, exactly 730. He had counted them once he had been lost in dreams. At the time he had put no faith in those dreams and was only tantalizing himself by their hideous but daring recklessness. Now, a month later, he had begun to look upon them differently, and in spite of monologues in which he jeered at his own impotence and indecision, he had voluntarily come to regard this hideous dream as an exploit to be attempted, although he still did not realize this himself. He was positively going now for a rehearsal of his project. At every step his excitement grew more and more violent. With a sinking heart and a nervous tremor, he went to a huge house which on one side looked on to the canal and on the other into the street. This was let out in tiny tenements and was inhabited by working people of all kinds, tailors, locksmiths, cooks, Germans of sorts, girls picking up a living as best as they could, petty clerks, etc. There was a continual coming and going through the two gates into the courtyards of the house. 3 or 4 doorkeepers were employed onto the building. The young man was very glad to meet none of them. At once slipped unnoticeable through the door on the right, and up the staircase. It was a back staircase, dark and narrow, but he was familiar with it already. I knew his way, and he liked all the surroundings in such darkness. In such darkness, even the most inquisitive eyes were not to be dreaded. If I'm so scared now, then what would it be if it somehow came to pass that I were really going to do it? He could not help asking himself as he reached the 4th story. There his progress was barred by some posters who were engaged in moving furniture out of a flat. He knew that the flat had been occupied by a German clerk in the civil service, and his family. This German was moving out then, and so 4th floor on the staircase would be untenanted except by the old woman. That's a good thing, anyway, he thought to himself. As he rang the bell of the old woman's flat, the bell gave a faint tinkle as though it were made of tin and not of copper. The little flats in such houses always have bells like that. He had forgotten the note of that bell, and now its peculiar tinkle seemed to remind him of something and to bring it clearly before him. He started. His nerves were terribly overstrained by now. In a little while the door was opened a tiny crack. The old woman eyed her visitor with evident distrust through the crack, and nothing could be seen but her eyes, glittering in the darkness. But seeing a number of people on the landlady, she grew bolder and opened the door wide. The young man stepped into the dark entry, which was partitioned off from the tiny kitchen.